Liz Roberts, such a pleasure to be here with you today. CEO of Safe Horizon, which is the largest victim services agency for survivors of crime and domestic violence in the United States. And you've been in this field for a very long time. So I would love to start by asking, what are some pivotal moments that led you here, that had you choose this field and to stay here for so long?
Absolutely. And having this role really has been the honor of a lifetime. Every day I show up to work with the most incredible people doing work that I am deeply passionate about, and I feel very fortunate. I actually started out in this field as a 17-year-old college student. I was a fierce young feminist, and when I got to college, sought out volunteer opportunities that related to women's issues. And a friend of mine told me that there was a domestic violence shelter in the area that would take volunteers. And so I signed up as a volunteer. They trained me. They put me on the hotline every Thursday night from 6 to 11.
Oh, wow.
And so I had this incredible experience as a very young woman of answering hotline calls. And, I would pick up the phone not knowing who would be on the other end of the line. And there would be a total stranger there who would trust me with her story. And sometimes I was in the position to help her escape a dangerous situation right then and there. And I felt so moved and motivated by that experience that I have really dedicated my whole career to working with survivors of violence and abuse. The other aspect that is an important part of my story is that I witnessed violence as a child. And I came from one of those families where, something scary would happen, but we never talked about it. There was never an acknowledgement. There was never an apology. There was certainly never any opportunity to process how it made me feel. And so when I started working with survivors of domestic violence and their children, I began to put the pieces together about my own experience and to recognize how witnessing violence had affected me growing up and how it still affected me as a young adult. So there's been this beautiful parallel process of working in this field and also navigating my own healing journey.
Well, we can share some of those themes. I myself have similar stories in terms of like history and growing up and family dynamics, and also as a survivor of domestic violence myself. It's interesting you're talking about like how people handle it sometimes, or these things happen and then people step away, they don't talk about it. And I feel like the majority of people see it as a private concern, something that's dealt with behind closed doors. But the truth of the matter is that this kind of thing can really ripple out and extend to all kinds of societal issues, things like mass shootings, armed robberies, street assaults. And so what are some strategies that Safe Horizon uses in order to raise awareness about that ripple effect that domestic violence has?
Yeah, I think that's so important. When we do think of it as strictly a private matter, not only are we abandoning people who are in abusive relationships and children who are witnessing violence, but it's also very short-sighted because, as you say, violence in the home really can be a precursor to so many other kinds of violence, so many other kinds of crime and disruption in our society. And so, we look for opportunities where we see those things coming together in a media story, and we look to connect the dots to point out how domestic violence may have been a warning sign or a precursor, really created the conditions for this terrible thing that now has very much spilled out into the community. And I think, one of the things that's special about working at Safe Horizon is that we do work with survivors of all types of violence, abuse, and exploitation. So domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault, human trafficking, and community violence. And so that gives us the opportunity to see how all of these things are interconnected and how often if you kind of dig below the surface, you'll find a history, especially of family violence, child abuse, or domestic violence that set the stage for something that we're seeing now in another form.
Can you tell us a bit about some of those programs, like for victims of crime, and you said sex trafficking, child abuse?
Yeah, and our goal at Safe Horizon is really to be there for all survivors here in New York City and to offer what they need at different points in their journey. And so that means everything from our 24-hour hotline and our online chat support to, longer term services like legal services, trauma treatment, long-term shelter. So our goal is to be there for survivors at all different points in their journey and for the various needs that they may present. And that means we can offer immediate help in a crisis through our 24-hour hotline, through our online chat, and we can also offer longer-term services like legal representation, like counseling to heal from trauma, like financial assistance to recover from violence. And so we have many different programs. We're in every neighborhood in the city, and we can be there for different needs at different points in somebody's journey.
Wow, it's a lot of important work there. What are some mental health issues that affect perpetrators? I'm really interested in that aspect. And additionally, if you can share some success stories about interventions or programs that led to positive changes, I'd like to know how potentially we can use some of those strategies in a wider societal practice.
Yeah, great question. And I'm really glad you raised that. So, the first thing I would say is that, committing intimate partner violence isn't in and of itself necessarily a mental health issue, and that we see people who have committed acts of violence against a partner who may or may not qualify for a major kind of mental health diagnosis, who may or may not have a substance abuse problem. And so when somebody comes to us and says, I think if he just stopped drinking, or I think if she just got therapy or stuck with her medication, the violence would stop. And we do have to say it might not. Coercive control, abusive behavior is learned behavior. And somebody who presents with a mental health issue and a violence issue really has two problems that they need to address, and they have to be willing to address both usually to make progress. That being said, we know that use of alcohol and drugs can exacerbate abuse. It can, result in more severe violence. It can result in escalation over time. And the same is true of untreated mental illness, that it can cause an escalation of violence over time. In terms of success stories, I'm really glad you asked that. And, I think there's been a tremendous amount of research and different kinds of programming over the decades that I've been in this field, really looking for reliable, effective ways to change the behavior of abusive partners. And it turns out it is quite difficult. I think one of the very important factors is, what is the incentive for change? And we need to make sure that as a society, we are making it clear that your life will be affected in lots of negative ways if you continue this behavior, that there is, a social disapproval, that the community and the family send a strong message that they expect the behavior to change, and that, when appropriate, there are consequences through the criminal legal system. We have had really good success with a program we developed about 5 years ago. It's called Safe Way Forward. It's a small program on Staten Island, and in that program we work with the whole family. So these are families where there's typically been pretty serious domestic violence. There's been child protective services involvement, maybe court involvement. And the parents may be together or separated, but they are raising children together. And so there is a need to help them be able to parent as, as co-parents, even if they don't choose to try to continue the relationship. And what we've found is that when we offer a combination of like trauma sensitive support and accountability to typically fathers who have been abusive, that there's a higher engagement rate than we expected, and that there is real progress for many of those men. And so that's a program that, it's been evaluated carefully by the city, which funds it, and where we're seeing really positive outcomes. And I think, one of the elements is that we do approach the person who's caused harm as a whole person. And we recognize that you can be compassionate and supportive and also hold them accountable for their behavior. And the other element that I think has helped that program to be successful is that wanting to be there for their children can be a real motivator. And that sometimes keeps somebody engaged and kind of willing to hear hard feedback and keep coming back.
You mentioned learned behavior, that a lot of this is learned behavior. Would you say that domestic violence is something that could be perpetuated from childhood, depending on how the child is raised and what they're exposed to?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been very strong and consistent research that shows that when children, and especially boys, witness intimate partner violence in their childhood, that they are more likely to be abusive to an intimate partner as teens and adults. There is absolutely a cycle there. And I think the important thing I would add is that's true without intervention. And so one of the most important things we can do to prevent and reduce intimate partner violence is actually to get to kids while they're kids and help them make sense of what they've experienced, help them experience safety, and help them process it so that they don't repeat it in an unconscious way as adults. And, getting to them before they have settled into a pattern of abusive behavior. So as children and as teens.
Right. What are some of the short-term and long-term psychological effects for survivors and their children, emotional impacts of these types of situations, and how can those effects persist across generations?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I've, seen this in my own life as well as in the lives of so many survivors that we work with. So survivors of intimate partner violence very often are experiencing a range of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which can include re-experiencing the violence through flashbacks, through intrusive memories. It can include having trouble kind of settling and calming your nervous system, which can affect sleep, can affect your anxiety level during the day, can affect, your ability to kind of show up and be successful at work or at school. We see, many survivors who have, persistent concerns around mistrust in relationships because of what they've experienced. And so it can be harder to find that true, rewarding intimacy in future relationships, understandably so. We see, many survivors who experience impact on their kind of spiritual life, a loss of faith or sort of trust in broader humanity. One of the most damaging and persistent effects of being in an abusive relationship also can be financial. So many survivors experience financial abuse, and that can include things like ruining your credit, running up debt in your name. It can include sabotaging somebody's education and career. And so, many survivors have a long journey of recovery on the financial side, as well as on the emotional side. And then for children who witness violence, we see similar things, but in the way a child experiences it. So witnessing violence can really disrupt healthy development for children. We often see a child who has just witnessed something terrifying loses some of their recent developmental progress. Maybe they were doing well with potty training, but suddenly they're back in a diaper. Maybe they had recently learned a new skill at school, but they have to learn it all over again because of the way that trauma and that terror really impacts the brain and the body. And so it affects children's development. It affects how they understand relationships. It even affects their kind of moral development, how they see the world, what they believe about, how you can be successful in the world, what it means to have power in the world. It affects all of that.
My particular area of research is psychological abuse and covert abuse. I have firsthand experience in how it can damage a life from the bottom up, bit by bit. And some of the tactics that I've learned about and witnessed are being isolated from family and friends, gaslighting. It could be threats. There's also intermittent reinforcement. Why is emotional abuse so difficult to detect? And how is it just as damaging as physical violence?
I would say first, sometimes the emotional abuse is more damaging than the physical violence. And I can't tell you the number of survivors who have told me over the years that, while being hit, physically assaulted was terrible, they found that the bruises healed, but the emotional scars were actually more difficult to heal. I think, the thing is, if somebody hurts you and leaves a bruise, you can see the bruise. And it's harder to argue with that. It's not impossible, but it's harder to argue with that. I think the thing with psychological abuse is it's sneaky. It gets under your skin. Often it builds over time. So it may start out seeming kind of innocuous, but that softens you up for the more severe stuff that comes later. And, there's a process of sort of disrupting somebody's sense of that I know my own reality, that I know who I am, and that I know what's happening around me. So that very often by the time survivors come to us for help, they've really been conditioned to question their own reality and their own experience, to constantly second guess themselves. It looks like undermining somebody's self-esteem. And, I've been really struck over the years by how good abusive partners are at finding those places where their partner is vulnerable. An example, I remember, I have my partner actually used to work in batterers intervention. So she ran groups for people who had abused their partners and been court ordered to services. And she told me two stories that have always stayed with me. One was about an abuser who had, broken things in the house during a rage. And they said, I don't even remember what I did. I was out of control. I just lost my temper. All of this sense of like it wasn't purposeful. I just couldn't help myself. But then when they asked the person to list exactly what they broke, every single thing belonged to the victim and was something that was important to her. And so there was something very purposeful underlining it, even though their story was, I didn't know what I was doing. The other example has stayed with me forever. They were in a group setting and sharing examples of some of their non-physical abusive behavior. And one of the men said, and this was before we kept our calendars on our phones, one of the men said, I sometimes would hide her calendar because I knew that would just ruin her whole day. She wouldn't know where she was supposed to be. She would think she had lost it. And one of the other men in the same group said the same thing. I did that too. And so it's such a good example of a psychologically abusive tactic, a gaslighting tactic that would be completely unsettling and where you could easily blame yourself. How did I lose it again? I'm so spacey. But actually it had been done to her. It was purposeful. It was intended to undermine and to throw somebody off their game in this very sneaky way. So I think it is hard to see it while it's happening because the person who's doing it intends for you not to see it. Right. And they find ways to do that. And if there's one thing I've learned in 40 years doing this work, it's that abusers are really opportunistic. So they will utilize whatever tools and opportunities are in their environment. And one of the ways we've seen that play out, of course, is with technology, that they are often, very clever in identifying technology-based ways to continue the abuse and to hide their tracks.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's so interesting because with emotional abuse, one isolated incident can seem so subtle. So if you try to explain it to someone on the outside, they might feel like the victim is overreacting. Like, I had several instances that mounted, and then, as an example of the calendar that you just talked about, for me, my house and car keys were hidden from me for several days. And I was told, well, why did you lose them? What's going on with you? Is there something wrong with your memory? And this was going on for several days where I was turning the house upside down, trying to figure out where they had
what did I do?
Gone. Right. And during that time, I wasn't able to leave the house. And when it's several incidents that mount and they just keep going over and over again like that, it starts to become like crazy making. And you can question yourself. And I know that for a long time after I left that relationship, I spent a lot of time looking over my shoulder, and it made my world really small. I didn't know who I could trust or talk to and tell where I was or where I was going, because I was afraid they were going to talk to my abuser and it was going to get back to him. And I didn't want that. So it's interesting. I have talked to other people that went into hiding essentially and just kind of lay low and become, kind of have a quiet life afterward for a while because they just don't want to be found or or bothered, and it's scary. So
yeah. I think what survivors go through to find safety and to create a space for healing often does mean walking away from things that are really important to them. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be the abuser who has to step back, who has to give things up. But very often, unfortunately, it is the survivor, and it's so unjust. It's so unfair. I feel like I've supported so many survivors through that process of like, this is what I have to do for my safety and my well-being, but it shouldn't be this way.
Absolutely. I definitely went through a long mourning period, having to let go of a lot of my livelihood and things I had built to keep myself and my child safer. So yeah,
it's a lot of loss.
It is.
That's one of the things people outside this field don't understand, is how much loss is involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, and speaking of people on the outside, I also know that there are friends and family members that sometimes feel helpless, and they may want to help, but they don't know how. So what are some of the subtle signs that victims and their loved ones should be or could be aware of? And what are some harmful and helpful things that they could do when they suspect that someone is experiencing abuse?
Yeah. Such a great question. I think we should talk about that so much more in this society. So in terms of some of the subtle warning signs, because it's not often that physical violence happens in front of family or friends. That tends to happen behind closed doors. But the things that you might see in your loved one's life and relationship are kind of escalating control, a sense that they can't make decisions for themselves on their own, but that they always have to defer to their partner in their decision making, that they always have to, account for their whereabouts. The other thing, and you mentioned this earlier, is isolation. We so often see that over time, abusive partners find ways to drive a wedge between that survivor and anybody who might be a true support to them. That might be a sister, a mother, a dear friend. And sometimes it's, it's subtle and it's indirect. So maybe every time you go to your partner's family for, a holiday dinner, there's a big fight afterwards. And it's not clear that the purpose of that fight is to keep you from doing that again, but in fact, it does have that effect. I don't want to do this because there'll be a huge fight afterwards. Or maybe it's, discouraging you from reaching out or speaking negatively about those friends or those family members that you used to rely on, driving a wedge little by little by little. So I think if you see somebody that's in a relationship where there's some of that controlling behavior that's evident, and where they're kind of slipping away from you, that would be a moment to say, hey, I wonder if there's more here.
Right.
The other thing that I think is often an early sign is jealousy. And it can seem flattering to the person who's experiencing it. But that kind of jealousy of, I don't want you to be seen with that person, or you can't go out to dinner with that person because I think they want to be with you. That kind of jealousy can really escalate over time and can become kind of the excuse for violence.
Absolutely. Can you share some examples of individuals who have turned their experience of pain into an inspiring path toward healing and empowerment? And are there any stories of resilience that have particularly inspired you?
I want to start by saying your story is incredibly inspiring, and that you are, taking your experience and really drawing on it to provide education and awareness and spread the word about how we can interrupt these cycles is something that means a lot to me. And you've been a member of our Speakers Bureau, so we have a number of survivors on our Speakers Bureau who similarly are kind of turning that something very painful into something beautiful. That's inspiring to me every day. And, at Safe Horizon, I'm fortunate to be surrounded by people who are, constantly kind of transforming their pain into healing in one way or another. Our clients, our staff, so many of whom are also survivors, our board members, 30% of the people on our board are survivors of violence, and just taking extraordinary steps to make a difference in the world.
Yeah. Thank you for your words. To me, this topic is so deep and fascinating, and there's so many layers, and there's so much that we can learn about now and continue to learn about. But something that I'm also very passionate about is finding that silver lining, and knowing and understanding that people can turn this around, and that it can become a very empowering story. So I'm very passionate about that. So for our listeners, what are some healing practices that a survivor can exercise when they're maybe just coming out of this and they want to recover from their trauma and start to reclaim their life?
I mean, the first thing I would say is just a message of hope. We know so much now about how to heal trauma and how it lives in the brain and in the body and in our behavior. And there's so many beautiful resources out there to help survivors to cope and to heal over time. So, it's really hopeful. And I think that's very important. I also think healing is different for each of us. So for some people, a relationship with a trauma therapist who's really skilled may be the main kind of vehicle for their healing. For others, it may be artistic expression. It may be through their spirituality. It may be through healing their relationship with their body through, restorative yoga or dance or other practices. And I think for most of us, it's probably a combination of those kinds of things. I think surrounding yourself with people that are just reliably caring and trustworthy and making space to let those feelings of loss, of rage, of grief, of fear, to let those feelings have the space and attention they deserve, and then over time to let them go.
Yeah, and understanding, also that it's not all your fault, So a lot of people can kind of have shame around it or not want to express it.
I think there's definitely a cognitive component. It's like while you're in the relationship, you're coping and you're making sense of your day-to-day experience in a certain way. And then, if you end the relationship and, or in a healing journey, you may have to reevaluate a lot of that and really, replace some of the self-blame and some of the blame that you've received from the abusive partner with more accurate understanding of what actually happened.
Absolutely.
I'm curious for you, in addition to that kind of cognitive process of reevaluating, what was most helpful?
Well, I'm a very curious person, so I liked to study more about it. I wanted to talk to other survivors. I immediately joined the Speakers Bureau here at Safe Horizon. Safe Horizon helped me so much when I was disentangling from that abusive relationship, helped me through the court system, navigating that and helping me to obtain an order of protection. And then also because what I experienced was a lot of psychological violence and emotional covert abuse, I really wanted to understand it.
Yeah.
So I took to studying, reading, and writing a lot about it. And I've actually, I have a book that I'm developing that's talking about specifically this subject, and also just sharing my story and hopefully being able to have others hear it and have it help them if they're trying to understand what's going on and that if they might be going through something similar.
I think that'll be so powerful. I've heard so many survivors say that the topic of psychological abuse just isn't talked about enough, and that they minimized what had happened to them because it was only verbal or psychological, as opposed to really understanding how deeply harmful that can be.
I think there is a lot of misinterpretation around psychological abuse and covert abuse. And again, because it's so subtle and it's more insidious. It's a slow, insidious process.
Yeah.
So more difficult to understand, more difficult to pinpoint. But also a very important thing to try to understand better.
And so powerful when you can reclaim your thoughts and the way you look at yourself and your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you've been in this field for a very long time. How many years?
Since 1983, if you count my years as a volunteer. So yes, a long time.
So how has the landscape of this field of domestic violence evolved over this time that you've been in it?
So much. I mean, when I started out, the first shelters in the country had only been around for like 5 years or so. Most of them opened in the late 70s or after that. So we were very early on in this journey. What I'm most proud of in terms of our field's work is that we have built a much broader range of options for survivors. And, we've also worked on systems change that has made various systems more responsive, more flexible to meet the needs of survivors. So that's been really beautiful to see. And, the truth is, if you look at the long run, there has been a decline in domestic violence in this country.
Fantastic.
it's very slow. And that's been very frustrating for me, that it's not the kind of rapid transformation we all want to see. But we do see the numbers in terms of rates of domestic violence and rates of homicides coming down very slowly over time. At the same time, if you were to compare the domestic violence rates to other crimes, we've made more progress on other crimes. Domestic violence is harder to turn around, and we have more work to do.
If you could share 3 things that you hope to see for the future regarding prevention, legal reform, education, or even treatment of perpetrators, what would you hope to see?
When I think about the next 25 years, one of the things I would like to see is a much bigger public and private investment in prevention. There's so much suffering that results from domestic violence. We've been talking about the long-term psychological effects, the long-term financial effects, and we don't have to wait for it to happen and then respond. We can actually go further upstream. We can prevent it before it happens by doing much broader and more consistent education for children, for teens, about healthy relationships, about what to do when you're frustrated, or what to do if your partner is behaving in a controlling or threatening way. We could do so much more in terms of helping children who have witnessed violence heal, and also helping child abuse victims heal, so that there's a less of a chance of repeating the cycle in the next generation. We know when the police go to a home where there are children present to respond to domestic violence, we should be getting effective trauma treatment to that adult and those children right away in every single case.
Absolutely.
And all it takes is the political will and the investment to make that happen. At Safe Horizon, we have a special program called the Child Trauma Response Team, where we can respond immediately with support for a caregiver and her children who have experienced violence. And we know that that's effective. We know that people heal more quickly and more thoroughly if they get help right after an incident. The other thing that I would like to see is, really looking at some of the systems that cause more hardship for survivors and children. And so our family court system, routinely people tell us that going through the family court system after experiencing violence is just an arduous, wearing, discouraging, difficult process, and it ought to be easier. And so I think making sure that every survivor has excellent legal representation, and looking at how these systems can operate better, more efficiently, and more compassionately would be another priority for me.
I would like to leave our audience with some inspiring words. So if you could leave our listeners with one impactful message about the journey from pain to purpose, and how they would be able to embody that in their own lives or the lives of those that they care about, what would that message be?
I would just say, whatever you have experienced, no matter how bad it's been, no matter how long it's been, no matter how bad you feel right now, healing is always possible. It is always available. And there's so many of us out here who really find, purpose and joy in supporting people in their healing journeys. And so reach out, call an anonymous hotline, look for your local victim service provider and walk in and ask for help, because it is here, and things can and will get better if you let yourself believe that's possible.
Wow, thank you. Well, I'm so grateful to you, and I'm also so grateful for this organization, everything Safe Horizon has to offer, and the journey that I've had working with Safe Horizon, and knowing all of you has been amazing. So really, thank you so much for your work.
Well, right back at you, Jael. Your courage and just the way that you were raising your voice is so inspiring and beautiful. And, you're forever part of the Safe Horizon family.
Thank you.
And we look forward to continuing this journey together.
Thank you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. This was fun.